also a party referring an MP to the police.
That baffles me. It baffles me. We are a party. It does baffle me. I don't understand. The hurty words must have been very, very hurty indeed.
Hello and welcome to the Spectator's weekly omnibus edition. For this omnibus, we're going to try and do something a bit different at the beginning because we've been inspired by Donald Trump and Elon Musk shamelessly flogging Teslas outside the White House. So we're going to shamelessly flog the Spectator and various Spectator products. First of all, let's bring your attention to the magazine, which is, as you will probably already know, the greatest magazine in the world. This is this week's edition. The cover is Massacre of the Innocents. Paul Wood, Colin Freeman and Father Benedict Keeley look at the slaughter of Christians, Alawites and others in the Middle East. It's very disturbing stuff, but brilliantly covered by those three. We also have Rod Liddle and Douglas Murray covering the split in the Reform Party, which is a very interesting subject in British domestic politics. And Mary Wakefield writes about her cat, which she seems to have become fond of, even though she hates cats, but not as fond as her husband, Dominic Cummings, who seems completely besotted with the animal. The other thing we want to plug, there's lots more, by the way, in this edition of The Spectator, but I couldn't possibly go through it all. There is a school supplement, which should be useful to anyone who's interested in education, private or state. So that's the magazine. Do subscribe. You can find a link below for a subscription to The Spectator. You will not regret subscribing to this magazine. But I also need to bring your attention to some Spectator products. Forgive me while I lean down and pick up this cap, which you can buy for £20. Again, click on a link below and you'll find it. Just £20. They're proving very popular, so buy while stocks last. I'll put it on in order to plug the next product, which is Spectator Gin. I'm not drinking at the moment because it's Lent, but as soon as it's over, I'm going to drink some of this Spectator Spring Gin. That's only £30 a bottle, so get some of that. And there we go. That's the selling section done. Let's move on to the omnibus. First of all, this week, we talked about that implosion I mentioned earlier in Reform. I think calling it an implosion is a bit of an exaggeration, but let's go with it. Trouble in Reform Party paradise, perhaps. Katy Balls spoke with James Heale and Gawain Towler, who is probably the best person to talk to about what's going on in Reform, because he says what he thinks.
So we've heard a lot about the professionalisation of the Reform Party, and I think actually it was the same trio as currently assembled. Just before Christmas, we're talking about whether 2025 would be the year of Farage, and we did mention that infighting could be a problem, and it turns out that infighting is a problem. You had on Friday the news that through a statement from the Reform Party that Rupert Lowe, one of the party's 5 MPs, the MP for Great Yarmouth, had been referred to the police by the Reform Party, was facing 2 complaints allegedly involving staff members, and was also accused of threatening behaviour towards the party chairman, Zia Youssef. It's worth pointing out that Rupert Lowe denies all these charges, has suggested this could be an elaborate witch hunt, and links it to bad blood between himself and Nigel Farage and others in the Reform Party. And of course, just a few days before this happened on Friday, there was an interview in the Daily Mail with Rupert Lowe, in which he suggested that Nigel Farage was not the Messiah and therefore should stop acting like he was. Now, if we're joining all these dots, and let's throw in again a few more denials from all sides that anyone has done anything wrong, this then rolled into the weekend. And you had both Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe coming out saying infighting is bad for the party, but doing so separately. And there's not really a clear sense of how they're going to stop the infighting yet. But as we both wrote, James, in a cover piece for The Spectator a few weeks ago, tension between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe and the wider party is nothing new. It's been quite evident for some time. There's been, I think, a few clashes between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. You think back to when Elon Musk took to social media, his platform X, to say that Nigel Farage did not have what it take to effectively lead the Reform Party. Nearly all, Reform figures came out being very effusive in praise for Nigel Farage. And while Rupert Lowe did tweet, it was not seen as suitably loyal compared to the other messages by some involved. And then I think you add to that differences on policy. Rupert Lowe, I think, a few times has spoken a bit out of step, whether it's on devolution or other matters. But also now, one of the things he said is he believes he's the target of this witch hunt because... one of the reasons he says is because he was very saying we need more deportations, pushing for an even harder line on immigration, and that was not welcomed by Nigel Farage, and that's potentially opening a front that could cause problems later down the line if you can successfully paint Nigel Farage as being too mainstream, selling out in order to get to power. And I think for now you just have quite a messy situation where KC looking into this inquiry seems to distance themselves from some of what Rupert Lowe has said. However, you now have a former Tory MP coming out saying that they've spoken to one of the staffers who allegedly put the complaint in against Rupert Lowe, suggesting it's not about Rupert Lowe, and therefore the whole situation is very murky. And I think given both are saying that the only way forward is one of unity, is that one where the two come back together? Or is that one, which is perhaps more to the liking of many in the Reform Party, close to Farage, one where reform continues, but Rupert Lowe is not to do with reform?
I mean, Gawain, the timing of this is quite coincidental, isn't it? Is a witch hunt gone on here?
I'd like to pick up something. In the original statement that was put out by the party, it said in Mr. Lowe's office. It did not say Mr. Lowe. They never claimed it was Rupert who was involved in the bullying allegations. That just wasn't true. And people seem to have read the statement very fast and responded very quickly without actually reading the statement. I would point out. So that was never the case. It's unedifying. It's no fun. It is significantly unideal or suboptimal. A whole range of words suggesting I wish they were very well wouldn't. As I see it, the party has grown largely on the back of Farage's ability to cut through and speak to the general public. It was getting somewhere before. Tyson did an excellent job before the election, building it, keeping it alive, growing it, and all the rest of it. He'd done an excellent job. But there's no doubt that Farage is mercurial and quicksilver when it comes to these things. And that change since July to now, with the 400 new branches, the 219,000 members, the 27% of the polls, at times leading the polls, this is largely down to Farage's leadership. Now, Rupert is a very able man. He has been a very successful businessman. And his business career, he's wound people up on numerous occasions, as we all know. But business and politics are bedfellows, but they're not always the most comfortable of bedfellows. And if you have been in charge of a multi-million operation, you've employed a lot of people, and you are the boss, it can be frustrating if, when you click your fingers, everybody doesn't jump to your tune. And so Rupert has been getting increasingly frustrated. Now, the fact is, we are developing policy. That's in hand. The complaints in the Mail piece were on issues such as this. Yes, of course we are, but there's a limited amount of resources and limited amount of brains sitting in their office. I remember in September, before I was fired, somebody coming to Nigel with some policy proposals and suggestions. He said, crack on, go away, work on it, don't talk to me about it until March, because I've got so many other things on my plate. Rupert wants there to be policy now, and he's putting out a whole series of suggestions. And you mentioned the migration thing. Nigel, one thing I think everybody in politics agrees is Nigel is brilliant at timing. He is Rupert is more of a populist. Nigel is an unpopulist. He takes unpopular ideas and popularizes them, whereas Rupert is taking what looks like a populist idea, the remigration, or the deportations. We've made it very clear that anybody who's broken the law and is a migrant, particularly illegal migrants, gone. But if you cannot move 1 million people instantly, it's just not possible. It's not practical.
But what Rupert Lowe would say would be that that's all about policy. This is in terms of the laws and what's actually gone on here and the legal right and wrongs. This is a bit of a political witch hunt. Do you disagree?
I don't think so. The timeline will out. I mean, you mentioned the KC. The KC has questioned some of the things that Rupert has said, but it hasn't exonerated the original allegations. Now, I understand, and I may be wrong here, I understand that the two members of staff, one of whom used to work for Bridgen, and I mean, this sort of clarification, we all knew that from the start, which is why I find it's odd that we've had a clarification on something we knew. But the allegations, they were employed in Parliament. They are parliamentary employees. The HR processes being conducted are ipso parliamentary things. That's the responsibility. The party is desperate not to be accused of brushing things under the carpet and things of this sort, because we've seen that in other parties, have we not? They delay, and it's the cover-up rather than the fact that's often the worst thing. So the party comes in and says, these allegations have come to our notice, we must handle them. But actually they're being handled anyhow. So Rupert, you can imagine, being the sort of chap he is, would have received something from the party, and he'd say, well, it's in hand. You don't need to be involved because it's being dealt with. And the party was saying, no, we've got to do it. And so therefore there's these crossed wires, cross purposes. And I can understand why Rupert kicked back. But it's not that he hasn't, the claims, I think, that he hasn't cooperated. He has cooperated with the parliamentary HR thing.
Yeah, but the police thing, I mean, also a party referring an MP to the police.
That baffles me. It baffles me. We are a party. It does baffle me. I don't understand. The hurty words must have been very, very hurty indeed, if it is a verbal threat. Personally, I think that in politics one has to grow a thicker skin. But that doesn't mean one encourages bad behaviour or things of this sort, and it is unedifying, deeply unedifying. And one wishes it didn't happen. But I wasn't a witness. I haven't been there. I don't know what was said. I don't know how bad it was. I understand yesterday there was a claim that it was 83 days or something, that one event took place in December.
Yeah.
But the other event and they did ignore that. The other event took place much more recently, and that's why they reported it. It was the second, not the first. So that's what I understand to be the case.
And Katy, I mean, assuming that we don't see an immediate rapprochement between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage, how much of a thorn would Rupert Lowe be on the side of Farage?
So he's lost the whip. So now we have 4 Reform MPs. So I think, you could say a reduction of 20% in terms of party size. That can create some issues. But I mean, it was really the case they're a very small flank in Parliament and not at the number whereby it helps you particularly get questions and so forth. I think the question is, does Rupert Lowe have enough of a following and enough focus to be a thorn in Nigel Farage's side if things stay as they are? And you look at the history of Nigel Farage, and Gawain will know more than me, but there's always been a sense that he has been able to quite quickly get rid of potential threats and opponents, and they haven't really caused him too much bother. On Rupert Lowe, I think it has been quite clear he has been building a following. Mm-hmm. I remember going to the Reform annual conference in the autumn and sat there. I think I was pushed to the very back of a room because it was so full. I having some, like an inflatable wall pressing on my head. It was that busy. It's one of my memories up on the balcony. But watching the speech after speech, Rupert Lowe had various standing ovations. He was a real hit with the crowd. I think he quoted Socrates at one point. It landed pretty well in the industrial estate of Birmingham by the international airport. So the crowd was, very enthusiastic for him. And I think also his online presence, particularly some call it Elon fishing when you try and get retweeted by Elon. It could be that Elon Musk just particularly does see his tweets, but either way, he is regularly retweeted by Elon Musk. He has a very large following online. And I think his style of just putting out, kind of monologue type statements on immigration and others means that, within the Reform base, there is a base which is Rupert Lowe specific. Is it bigger than the support from Nigel Farage? I would say no. And I don't think it's quite at that point yet. But of course, if you have Rupert Lowe hanging around the House of Commons, still with that Twitter and social media presence, who now feels... I don't think he felt inhibited to say things anyway, to be fair. But even more, just doesn't even now get an Aggie message from a Reform staffer saying, please, can you not go off message? None of that now. You have him saying that as Reform try and do, Gawain was talking about, which is a more carefully charted path of the timings of election cycles, when to get your message out there. But Rupert gets lots of attention for the things he is saying. Then potentially that does open a bit of a right flank against the Reform leadership, because you have other figures such as Ben Habib and others who have already come out and said that they feel as though Nigel Farage is potentially selling out a bit to get to a certain point. So I think it could be an annoyance. I don't think this is going to be what decides Nigel Farage's leadership, not least because for all the talk of how, the party is democratising, it's still pretty impossible when you look at actual rules to get rid of Nigel Farage. The party is still very loyal to him. Most think Nigel Farage is probably the best thing in terms of how Reform would get to the point of power or power sharing at the next election. But it is still probably one of Kemi Badenoch's best weeks since
she hasn't said a
became
single word or
leader.
done a single thing. Yes,
exactly. She's just sat there, and that's probably very well advised. And again, perhaps it's not a particularly high bar, but of course, if it does start to look as though, this is a party that can't really function, and some of the previous criticisms of Farage outfits come back, that is probably better than anything Kemi Badenoch has managed to achieve on her own terms so far.
I mean, critics will just say that it shows that, for all the talk about Nigel Farage and the new party changing, etc., doesn't it show that they can't even have more than 5 MPs without falling out?
I think one of the, and this is something that I've been pondering over the last few months actually, is the sort of people who will stand for reform are very able, they're very diverse in background, very diverse in experience and knowledge. They will generally be very successful in what they do in a whole range of things. This is going to be brilliant if we do get to power share or into government for the governance of this country. Their abilities in committee and drafting legislation and asking questions and all this is top drawer. It'll be the best retail offer of candidates this country has seen for well over 100 years. But whipping is going to be a nightmare because they are all driven. They know stuff. They're a bit like that picture. I'm a cat. I drink coffee, and I read and I drink coffee stuff. They are going to be good, and Rupert is one of these people. He's an example of that. And I think whilst the structures are getting so much better internally, the branches, the regional thing, the campaigning, the getting boots on the ground, knocking on doors. I mean, the amount of people, even despite this fuss on Friday, that were out this weekend all over the country campaigning was phenomenal. The next stage of that professionalisation may be working out how one deals with big characters, with good ideas, who will rub against each other sometimes. It's the nature of politics, and it's the nature of the beast.
And you do see that. I mean, every party has an issue managing its MPs. Of course, the Tories have a particular issue. Keir Starmer now has a bit of an issue. You look at the different caucuses being formed
the farmers,
every day.
the rural.
Quite.
Stop at IHT.
Exactly.
And the Tories, let's sack the boss. How many times have we heard that?
But
how long? Kemi, everybody's going to be writing letters to get rid of
suppose-
Kemi. This is the norm in politics, and to feel it isn't,
it just doesn't bode that well.
It's not ideal.
You have the infight when there's only 5 MPs. What would it look like if there were 80? But that said, I remember having a conversation with someone involved with the Reform Party a couple of months ago, and even then they were talking about some of the Rupert Lowe tensions, and saying, well, we can't actually afford to get rid of him now, but once you actually have more MPs, more aligned, then you have more freedom there. So it can work both ways.
Basically, in a party, though it's big in the countryside, it's big in its membership, absolutely, but it's very small in Westminster. Obviously, the focus is much greater and the pressures are greater on a smaller number of people. You see these splits they're much more apparent than they are in a much larger party where you may have people in that mood, but there's X hundred, so it doesn't matter so much. But I don't think it's different. It's not unusual. These things happen. Worse things happen at sea. It doesn't seem to be, and I agree with Katy, it's certainly not fatal. And the other thing is, with Rupert's great online presence, I'm not saying that there aren't many people in his X 100,000 followers that are supporters of reform, but I think the loudest support base is reform adjacent rather than reform. I don't think one of the members had a number of people write to them, email them saying, "I've resigned." And one of the staff checked, and none of them were actually members of the party. So a lot of this fuss is coming from people who want to shift reform from where it is onto a different territory. And I'm not 100% sure that they're all actually members of reform.
Next up, the border crisis. Brendan O'Neill spoke to John Connolly about what's going on with illegal entries into the United Kingdom.
You wrote this week for Coffee House about a man called Abu Wadi who entered into Britain from the Channel across one of the small boats last week. Start us off, can you tell us a bit about this man and why in particular people are worried about him coming into the country?
Yeah, it's a worrying development. So Abu Wadi is from Gaza. He seems to have made his way to Britain, and he posted a video of himself seemingly crossing the Channel and arriving in the UK, saying, "Thank God we finally arrived in Britain." And this is a man who reportedly has a pretty dodgy track record. I mean, there are images of him online posing with an AK-47, posing with projectiles that he reportedly threw towards the Israeli border. He's a man who has seems to have sung the praises of Hamas. And worst of all, there are allegations that he's used his social media to call for the slaughter of Jews, to say that Allah should come and kill the Jewish people, and to really just spout anti-Semitic bile about the problematic Jewish people as he sees them. This is not the kind of person we want in our country. And one of the points I make in my piece for Coffee House is that I think Jewish security needs to be a central part now of our border security. You know, who is coming to this country? And is a big question that we should always ask ourselves. And one of the reasons people should not be allowed into this country, I think, is if they harbour violently anti-Semitic views. Kick them out.
As you say, it's pretty worrying. We should probably say that Abu Wadi has been charged by the Home Office of entering the country unlawfully or unauthorised. But there is kind of a broader problem, I think, and you touched on this in your piece, which is that we maybe are seeing more people come into the country from Gaza. For all the suffering there, it is also a place that has a pretty big problem often with anti-Semitism. Is that something in particular you worry about?
Yeah, hugely. You know, there is this, amongst the left, there is this sense that people in Gaza need our help. We should let them come here. We should let refugees come to the UK from Gaza. No one doubts that what's happening in Gaza is awful. People are suffering enormously. I think Israel had every right to fight against Hamas. I still think it does. But it has caused huge suffering, as wars always do. So people there need assistance. They need help. And many of them will need to be refugees at some point, I think, in the countries around Gaza. But I do think we have to get real here in Britain about who we allow into the country. And the truth of the matter is that Gaza has had a violently anti-Semitic government for almost 20 years, i.e. Hamas, the Hamas ministry, Hamas militants. It's a country in which there is a lot of anti-Semitic fervour, anti-Semitic feeling. We know from numerous reports that in some schools in Gaza, including UNRWA-run schools, there are lessons in anti-Semitism. There are lessons in which kids are taught to hate Israel and even to hate Jews. So we have to be careful. We have to prioritise, I think, our own national security and particularly the security of the British Jewish people. We have a lot of Jews in this country. They have a long history here. They have every right to live in safety and dignity. And therefore, we have to be careful not to throw open the doors to people who come from a part of the world which tragically has a problem with anti-Semitism. So I do think we have to be on our watch when it comes to refugees from Gaza.
And I think it's the case as well that the Abu Wadi is probably quite an unusual individual in the sense that he's got quite a large social media presence. He does these TikTok videos with thousands of followers. His views, what they are, were kind of picked up quite quickly once he entered the country, which, you know, he self-posted a video himself seemingly arriving in the country. That's not going to be the case for a lot of individuals. I kind of imagine then that a lot of this isn't going to get picked up at present. Is that right?
Yes, that's the issue. I was thinking exactly the same thing, that this is a guy who has a large social media presence. He has lots and lots of followers on social media So it was relatively easy to trace his history of the things that he said and the things that he's done. And the campaign against anti-Semitism did a really good job on telling us who this guy is. But as you say, there will be lots of other people coming here who we know nothing about, whose names we don't know, whose histories we don't know. Have they been involved in Hamas? Have they been involved in other radical Islamist groups? Do they still hold those views? We just don't know when it comes to a lot of the people coming on the small boats in particular. I do think we have a crisis at our border at the moment. And I'm someone who's pretty liberal and open-minded on the question of immigration. I'm not a close the borders person, but I do think we need to know who is crossing our borders, whether they have the right to, whether they are doing it legally, which is one thing, or illegally, which is another thing entirely. We have to ask ourselves these questions. And it's very interesting to see Keir Starmer kind of puffing up his chest about the importance of protecting Ukraine's borders and Ukraine's sovereignty from Russian aggression, which, by the way, I think is a very noble goal. That's something that people should support. But he can't control Britain's borders. He can't control his own borders. And we have people crossing over who have had associations with radical Islamist movements and who hold hateful, bigoted, regressive views that pose a threat to national security. So for him to pontificate about the sanctity of Ukrainian borders while essentially allowing our own to become increasingly porous, that's an unsustainable position. And I do think we have to get much more serious about what's happening on our borders, what's happening on our shores, who's coming here, and what we're going to do about it.
I think a problem as well, Brennan, is that once we've identified that someone may be a danger to this country who's crossed the border, it's not really clear what we can do next. I think the Conservatives have raised, in the case of Abu Adi, the fact that it may be difficult to deport such an individual, for example, because of our human rights law. Here's a problem, isn't it? Are we going to send people back to Gaza, for example?
It's a dual problem. On the one hand, we're not policing our borders properly. And on the other hand, once people do cross our borders, which they're doing in their hundreds and their thousands, there's not much we can do about it, or it takes a very, very long time because we are signatories to the Refugee Convention, or we're signed up to human rights legislation, or there are these various international treaties and ideas that we are subscribers to, which actually tie our hands in terms of what we can do. I think all of those things, it's become increasingly clear that they are an attack on our sovereignty and on not just our sovereignty, but other nations' sovereignty too. And a key part of being a sovereign nation is that you get to say who and what may cross your borders, what goods may cross your borders, what people may cross your borders. That is a central part of being a sovereign democratic nation. And at the moment, that part of our sovereignty has been completely watered down, partly by a lack of control at our borders, but also because of all this legislation we have that we've introduced into our own system, which means it's very difficult sometimes to expel or deport illegal migrants. We need to chop away a lot of that stuff. I think we need a much more realistic asylum system where we do offer assistance to people around the world who genuinely need it. For example, the Ukrainian scheme is a good example of that, or the Hong Kong scheme, where we do offer meaningful assistance to people who are in real strife. But at the same time as doing that, I think we need to dismantle that legislative infrastructure that prevents us from taking action against illegal migrants, people who claim to be asylum seekers but aren't really, and people who we don't want to have in the country. So it's a dual process where I think we should be open to taking in people who need somewhere to go, but we also need to be much firmer and much clearer in stating our desire to kick out of the country people who don't belong here.
And the fact that we aren't at the moment, and there are people and individuals who seem to sort of profess, loyalty towards Hamas, for example, or antipathy towards Jews. This is obviously coming at a time of what seems like rising anti-Semitism in the UK. What kind of message do you think that's sending to Jewish people who live in Britain?
I think it's sending a terrible message. And I know a lot of Jewish friends of mine feel increasingly insecure or uncertain. And I did a talk at a Jewish centre just last week in London, and a lot of the people I spoke to said that they just feel they're not packing their bags, they're not ready to leave or anything like that, although I'm sure some are, but they do feel that Britain is not the same as it used to be. And that's a really tragic thing for any of our communities to feel. So the Jewish community already feels under pressure because since 7th of October 2023, we've seen almost weekly marches where not only radical Islamists, but also clueless leftists have gathered on the streets, in some cases to express outright support for Hamas, but at least to express utter derision and hatred for the world's only Jewish nation. We've seen people waving placards where the swastika is tangled up with the Star of David. We've seen people saying that Zionists run the BBC and Zionists run America and Zionists run Britain. These kind of classic anti-Semitic tropes with a bit of, PC coverage in terms of saying Zionist instead of Jew. So they've seen all of that for the past 16, 17 months. And now they're hearing that, courtesy of our porous borders, people are coming here who seem to have had associations with Hamas. That's incredibly threatening, I think, to the Jews of Britain. They deserve to have safety and dignity. And at the moment they don't, partly because there is surging anti-Semitism within Britain itself, and also because we're not taking necessary measures to keep anti-Semites out of Britain. So it's a real mess. And I think if we're serious about our national security and serious about Jewish security, we need to get a handle on both of those things.
We're hearing a lot about children's mental health at the moment and a mental health crisis among young people in Britain and all over the developed world. I spoke to Abigail Shrier about whether therapy for children is a good idea. She rather thinks not.
If you look across the West, it's not just the UK. If you look across the West, in the last several decades, our funding and treatment for things like depression and anxiety have increased. So have the rates of those maladies. So in other areas where we expect that with the rise in treatment, with the greater sophistication of treatment, with the greater prevalence of treatment, we expect the problem to go down, right? Think about tooth decay and the availability of dental care. But with this problem, the more resources we pour into it, the more medications and psychiatric drugs we give young people who are suffering with the blues, it not only doesn't seem to help, but their problem seems to be getting worse. So we know at the very least we're not helping. That's quite clear, I think. The question is whether our treatments are counterproductive, and I believe that they are.
Well, at the start of the book, you talk about your own experience with therapy, and you then make this excellent point, I think, that you as an adult, and all adults, are able to say, okay, this therapy isn't really working for me, I'll stop. There's a sort of balance between you and the therapist. But when it comes to children, this problem of iatrogenesis, I think it's called, it gets worse because there isn't that balance, and children don't really understand what the therapist is doing to them. They don't have any autonomy.
That's exactly right. Remember that what I want people to know is that therapy for an adult is really a totally different project from therapy for a child. And here's the reason. First of all, if an adult seeks out therapy, they're making that choice. They're saying, I need to do some work, or I think I could use some extra help with this. And they're making that decision, and you have their buy-in. And then they can they know themselves well enough to sort of help guide the therapist to say, I think I've misrepresented my mother. I think I need to do a better job of explaining this. But with a young person, an adolescent who goes into therapy at 14, 15, they're not really in a position to say, listen, maybe my mother went overboard, but I wouldn't call her toxic. And the problem is because they don't have that perspective, and it wasn't their choice to go to the therapist in the first place. Usually they're strong-armed by an adult. You have a situation where the therapist is basically pandering the child to get their buy-in. And at the same time, there's no guardrails because the child doesn't have the wherewithal to push back. Now, all of this is not nearly the same problem if a young person has a clear mental disorder. So if the young person is suffering with anorexia, it focuses the mind. The therapist says, let's get in there, let's do the treatments, and we can measure if it's getting better, right? Are you putting on weight? The problem is when a young person sits down for psychodynamic psychotherapy, there are very few guide rails. There's no one observing, and there's no one measuring to see if they are getting better or if the therapist is making the young person's worries and sadness worse.
Is a large part of it this verb parenting? Because I've heard one of our writers, Jenny McCartney, a while ago wrote a piece saying problems started to begin when parenting went from being parent to parent, became a verb rather than being a noun, and that actually parenting is extremely hard. It's difficult to do, and because we all lead busy lives and so on, we are increasingly outsourcing an important part of the emotional upbringing of our children to therapists and counsellors and so on.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. It turns out what kids really need, and this has been measured, this has been studied, not by me, by academic psychologists. There's wonderful research on this. Things that they need are authority in the home. They need authoritative parents, which doesn't mean cruel or unloving, just parents who set down rules and present themselves as the authority. Those kids with authoritative parents do better on all kinds of metrics, not only success, but rates of anxiety and depression are far lower for those children. They need loving community, the same people around them who love them over time, not the nanny you hired, but cousins, extended family, and neighborhood kids, kids who really care about them, people who really care about them over time. And they absolutely need independence in the world, a feeling of efficacy, a feeling I can do things for myself. And the problem is we're not giving those kids those things. We're giving them way too much technology. They're spending way too much time in therapy and in therapeutic practice of focusing on their feelings and themselves. And these kids trapped in their heads with too little of the furnishings of a healthy life. And then we just pour in mental health resources, and it does not remediate the problem.
You mentioned technology there. Smartphones seem to have come along at a particularly bad moment when child mental health was already getting worse. Right. And that we seem to have thrown smartphones on. If you were to give it a sort of percentage, what percentage of the mental health crisis among children is generated by their use of smartphones compared to just the fact that they are over-therapized?
I think that if you removed smartphones, it would be probably one of the most significant things you could do to improve mental health. There's no question. And here's why. I believe because it's doing the same thing that therapeutic culture is doing. It's always leading a child back into their own head and isolation so that they ruminate on their sad feelings, their feelings of being left out, their feelings of lack of connection to others, their feelings of hopelessness. The content on social media, unfortunately, it provides none of the wonderful mental health benefits of in-person community and in-person companionship, and it increases a young person's focus on themselves. And I'll just give you one statistic. During COVID, we found that the young people who were in university, who remained in university in isolation, fared far worse in terms of mental health decline than the ones who came home to their families even when they desperately did not want to be there. Living in a home with mom, dad, siblings and grandparents sometimes, even when they desperately wanted to be back at university with their peers, they did much, much better in terms of mental health. And the reason is we need that in-person companionship, and we need to stop focusing young people on themselves.
Well, you, Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt seem to be leading a sort of movement against bad therapy and smartphone use in children, and you seem to be gaining a bit of traction, a bit of ground. Is there really an effective counter movement to the therapization of childhood? And when other therapists talk about resilience, do you regard that as a sign that therapy is thinking in the right way about how children can be made a bit tougher? Or is resilience itself, talking about resilience itself, a sign that we're sort of therapizing even just the concept of toughness?
Right. So what therapists have done, and I don't think intentionally, but I think that in the effort to take over all aspects of life, our therapy culture, what it does is it basically colonizes these words to mean what they have already been doing. So resilience in this context doesn't actually, when they say we're helping you build resilience, well, resilience is not something you learn through a therapist, and it's not something you learn in school through a social emotional class. It can't be learned that way for various reasons we could go into. But basically what they do is they co-opt these words and say, no, we're building resilience. Now we're making you stronger. Leading a child to focus on their feelings, and inevitably it always goes negative, focusing on their sad feelings, right? Because if we're focusing on their happy feelings, there's nothing to remediate. So it's always driving kids in a negative direction, and it's pretending to do something it can't accomplish, which is to build resilience for young people. They have to go out into the world and build that resilience on their own, and they do it largely through minor failure. All kinds of failure, picking themselves back up, getting back on that horse. That's how you build resilience. You don't build it by talking about your sad feelings with a teacher.
And there's also, as you say in your book, there is this understanding of happiness that therapy tends to generate, which is that happiness is something you can achieve. And if you are happy, you will feel happy all the time. And that just doesn't square with the human condition, does it?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, I invite your viewers just to consider this. Think about your grandparents. Think about the happiest older people you know. Would they have ever said that happiness was their goal or wellness, or that they felt entitled to be happy? The older generations never thought that they were entitled to happiness, and it certainly was never their life goal. And that was a very good thing. That's part of the reason they were much happier on average, because we've been able to study this. When you make happiness your goal, just focusing on it tends to coincide with less happiness. Researchers have studied this, and it really does stand to reason that if you're going to obsess with how am I feeling? How am I feeling now? What about now? Am I content now? The answer, if you ask yourself that enough times during the course of a week, a day, a year, the answer will be no. Actually, I have a little bit of shoulder pain. I have an itch in my throat. I have something that's not going quite right with a friend. And the obsessive focusing on that is driving young people to negative responses.
And we are driving our children to such negative response, to so many negative responses now, that drugs quickly come into the picture for parents of young children. And I mean, it is undoubtedly true that mental health does seem to be this problem. It seems to be getting worse, but drugs are not the answer, according to your book.
They're really not. I mean, it depends. I could go through the various kinds of drugs, but we know, first of all, that they come with massive side effects, including dependency. There are several of them create a chemical, a kind of dependency on the drug. And we see this with Ritalin, the ADHD medications. We see even this with antidepressants. When you remove them, there's a withdrawal. But not only that, the major problem with introducing these medications to young people, and of course, I'm not against them in every context. If a young person can't be stabilized another way, by all means, you do what you can to stabilize a young person. But here's the problem. They are still developing by nature, right? By definition. That is what adolescence is. So unlike an adult who can say, listen, I don't like what it's done to my sex drive. That was a big part of my, life. And now I have no sex drive. I don't like it. Please, doctor, find me something else or take me off this. And they can start to taper. We're getting in and fundamentally changing young people and their perceptions of themselves when they are still developing the resources to cope with the ups and downs of life. So we are making this major alteration, and they haven't even yet achieved a baseline knowledge of themselves. So it's a radical intervention. Unfortunately, it is taken, far too lightly, and it's having these massive side effects like weight gain, all kinds of dependence, and loss of sex drive, among other things.
You had an earlier book. Was it your first book? Forgive me for not knowing. Which
Yes.
was about our daughters and what's of transgenderism, the psychological effect we're creating through transgenderism and encouraging children to think of their sexuality as mutable. How naturally did that book lead on to bad therapy? And what are the connections between the two subjects?
Yeah, so I wrote about the sudden rise in transgender identification among teenage girls. And the question was, we knew these young people were suffering. Why were all of them suddenly deciding they were transgender? And basically my answer was, what I came to was that this was a social contagion, and that young people had convinced themselves, with the help of therapists and doctors and school counselors, that their problem was gender dysphoria. Their problem was that they were uncomfortable in their bodies because they were meant to be boys. And of course, this was an iatrogenic problem, meaning it was a problem largely introduced by social media influencers and therapists and doctors. And when I took a step back and I looked at all the harm therapists had done with regard to gender dysphoria and the transgender identification, convincing loads of young people that they were transgender when they really didn't have gender dysphoria, I wondered what other mischief they were making. And I do believe they have led a generation, not only therapists directly, but the school counselors who are aping therapists, the teachers who are taught to be therapists, the parents who are taught to raise their kids and act as proxy therapists in that way. I think we are all introducing greater worry, greater anxiety, and greater depression in young people by the constant focus on their mental health.
And another way in which we are introducing this anxiety among our children is through an excessive focus, as you argue, on trauma. And that not just those who've had very terrible things happen to them in their childhood are suffering from trauma, but that everyone in some way has trauma, because trauma can be genetically passed on. Minor traumas can actually be major traumas, and the whole sort of traumatic industrial complex, as it were,
That's right.
Feeds into that over and over and over again.
The mind is such a powerful thing. And unfortunately, if we focus on something or, we can very easily convince ourselves that we have this thing. And we're doing this with trauma. The reason we know that a lot of this belief that we have been traumatized and permanently injured in adulthood, or that the reason that we cannot hold down a job or commit to a loving spouse or, have successful professional life or relationships is because of our childhood trauma. The reason we know that that's not true, or it's very unlikely to be true, is because when they do prospective studies, when they look at, and they're wonderful researchers who have done this, when we go back and we look at the studies where they have studied children who are actually subjected to various kinds of abuse that has been verified, and then we take a control group of kids from the same era, in adulthood, we do not find greater psychopathy among the young children who went through childhood trauma, those who actually did. But when you ask adults and they say they were traumatized in adulthood, even when it turns out not to have been correct, when they go back and check, even when the events they remember turn out to have been misremembered, if they have adopted this narrative that they were traumatized, then they are much more likely to suffer adult psychopathology. So convincing ourselves that we have had childhood trauma turns out to be a great and unfortunately a very efficient route to mental instability as an adult and mental suffering as an adult. The very idea that we've been traumatized is making us sick.
And it seems to be, you mentioned some data there, but there's been, even since your book's come out, there's more and more scientific evidence has emerged that is pointing towards the correctness of your thesis.
That's right.
And so, I mean, it seems to me that you will win the argument in scientific terms if people look at the evidence properly.
I hope so. I mean, yes, I've been very fortunate. There are wonderful researchers in England and in Australia who have actually looked into these things, both at Oxford and there have been studies in Australia where they looked at young people who went through social emotional programs at school. And they found, and these were very rigorous prospective studies that have now been done, and they found that the young people emerging on the other end, they had a control group, and the young people who had gone through the social emotional training to help allegedly help them deal with their emotions and make them more resilient actually ended up less happy, more anxious, and had poorer relationships with their parents. And one thing to note is you might wonder why poorer relationships with their parents at the end, because young people, who's in charge of young people's, welfare? At the end of the day, convincing young people that they've been traumatized inevitably leads to a criticism of their family that was really supposed to protect them. And so, unsurprisingly, they ended up with much worse outcomes. And that's what we're seeing. It's been proven now through a series of studies, or there's good strong indication of it through a series of studies now. And I do hope that we will shift our focus away from this obsessive focus on mental health.
Isn't the great obstacle, though, guilt, parental guilt particularly, because a large number of people have put their children on drugs. A large number of people have therapized their children. And so to win this argument, you have to convince parents that they've made a mistake, that they're probably, without wanting to get too psychoanalytical myself, that they're probably going to be unwilling to confront.
I hope they can confront it, because the stakes are actually of changing course are not that great, and meaning they don't have that much to lose by changing course. Okay, if you put your kid on ADHD medication, you can talk to a doctor about how to taper off of that. It's never too late, and that's your child. I mean, that's your young person, or at least I hope it isn't too late. And I don't believe in most cases it is. See, I think the bigger problem is a loss of parental confidence. And you know what? We all make mistakes. It's no big deal. We're going to make mistakes in parenting. Fortunately, it's not a job. It's a long relationship, and there's time to correct course. And I do think that if you have a young person that you do not believe requires antidepressants, if there is no good reason to be on them, and I mean an overriding reason because you couldn't stabilize them otherwise, then it really is best to work with a doctor to see if you can perhaps get them off.
Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire this week in Saudi Arabia. It's a fast-developing story, but we had this fascinating conversation between Sergey Radchenko and our very own Svitlana Morenets.
Now, Sergey, just to start with you, how do you read this proposed truce? Is it a climb down from Ukraine, given that no security guarantees have yet been agreed?
To a certain extent, yes, because the Ukrainians first proposed not a complete truce, but just the cessation of military action in the air and on sea. So they agreed to this in return for America providing them with intelligence and military supplies. Both in fact have been frozen by the Trump administration, but now Trump has agreed, or the Americans have agreed, to reopen those lines for the time being, and so the Ukrainians have agreed to a general truce.
And Svitlana, is that how you read it as well, that this is President Zelensky kind of stepping back from what he would have wanted to get out of the US? This is not the ideal.
Yes, but it was important for Ukraine to show that the country is not the obstacle to peace, and now it's up to Russia to prove that to Trump. Because considering the relationship that has been between Zelensky and Trump recently, Ukraine had to make at least that concession to show that they are ready to talk.
One line that both Europeans and Ukrainian officials seem to have been using is that the ball is now in Putin's court. Mm-hmm. Is there almost an element of, trying to call his bluff, saying the Americans keep saying that Russia wants peace. And so now the Ukrainians, by agreeing to this truce, are saying, well, show us, we're happy for peace.
Of course, and now Putin has to choose between continuing his war effort in Ukraine or keeping his good relationship with Trump, what is more important to him.
Yes. And Sergey, what do you think? Could Putin actually say no or put some conditions on this truce? Does he have any room for that rejection?
So there are two possibilities. First of all, we have Putin himself fairly recently in December of last year talking about truce, and what he said in his remarks was that if you agree to truce, this will allow the other side to rearm, an opportunity to regroup or dig in, etc. And so this was not in Russia's benefit at the time when Russia is making gains on the battlefield. So that's on the one hand, he mentioned something like this last December. On the other hand, he has also repeatedly said that Russia is in favor of negotiating, although he has conditioned that negotiation with references to Zelensky's removal from power and so on and so forth. So in my view, the most likely outcome for Putin is going to be he'll want to be seen negotiating, but he will not want to make any real substantial concessions because I think his war aims remain unchanged.
When you say no substantial concessions, does that mean Putin will say, okay, let's consider this? But what counts as a concession in this case? Because 30-day truce along the current lines already seems quite positive for Russia, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's not what Putin wants. He wants much greater gains in Ukraine. He effectively wants to control Ukraine, politically control Ukraine. What he wants is a return to something like Istanbul, the negotiations that took place in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, which would entail a permanent neutrality for Ukraine, i.e. no NATO membership, demilitarization, i.e. a very limited military force that Ukraine would be allowed, and a number of other issues. And of course, also he wants to control the territories that he has already formally annexed but still does not control. So those, I think, are going to be his minimum demands, so to speak, regardless of the kind of negotiations that he goes into. The question is whether he will agree to truce now. Maybe just a temporary truce. In his earlier comments, he seemed to suggest that if it's just a very short period, that perhaps he could agree to that. But as we can see, we haven't had the Russian reaction yet. But what the Russians are trying to do now is to make maximum gains that they can on the battlefield, push Ukrainians out of Kursk, for example. That is something that they're trying to accomplish even now. The big question is whether then they will agree to pause in order to consider whether the Americans are likely to arm twist President Zelensky into agreeing to something like Istanbul or not. If the Russians pause, then we'll see another period of diplomatic activity.
I think Putin is more likely to agree to this temporal truce right now because of his troops that are currently rapidly advancing in the Kursk region. And before, it was the main obstacle for Putin to agree to this temporary ceasefire because he didn't want Ukrainian soldiers being on the Russian land. And now in the coming days, most likely Ukrainians will retreat from the region and Putin will then present it as a victory to the Russian people, that Russian land was liberated, and then he will say yes to the temporary ceasefire. But also I'm convinced he will ask for the partial sanctions relief from Trump as in exchange for him agreeing to the ceasefire.
And Svitlana, how do you read the drone strikes that Ukraine has hit Russia with, in particular Moscow, over 90 drone strikes on Tuesday night? Is that a negotiating tactic in this context?
I think it's just a show of strength to show that even with American aid, Ukraine is still capable of inflicting significant damage on Russia because of the mass production of drones that is currently happening in Ukraine.
Sergey, I guess it's anyone's guess if Putin comes back and negotiates what Trump will react with, because he has shown incredible large S in the way that he's talked about Putin rather than Zelensky. So I wonder if this American president will actually see that as a bit of a disrespect, that he's managed to get the Ukrainians around the table and it wasn't easy, and now Putin, you're coming back here and throwing the steel back in my face.
Well, obviously, Putin values his relationship with Trump, but I think he values his gains in Ukraine even more. He began this war because he wanted to control Ukraine politically, and he wanted to project a certain message to Russia's neighbors that Russia is "quote unquote" back and should not be messed with. And I think he will try to accomplish those goals regardless of what Trump puts on the table in the form of some ceasefire deal or something like that, because he has already built up his war economy. He has spent a huge amount of blood and treasure on this war. Will he stop now and just be happy with what he has in strip of land in eastern Ukraine? I'm not sure if this is actually the case. I think what he will try to do is he will try to gain politically what he could not gain through military force, i.e. he will try to come around to a situation where the Americans will do the work for him and will be arm twisting President Zelensky to agree to something like an Istanbul scenario going back to the spring of 2022, which would weaken Ukraine tremendously and make it much easier for the Russians to control Ukraine indirectly, as well as actually control the territories that they have formally annexed.
Now, of course, Svitlana, what's missing from the current agreement is the idea of security guarantees. Now, the US National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, did say that it did come up as a part of a discussion on a permanent future. Do we know what might be possible on the table, or is it just too far down the line to predict?
Maybe it's too early to say what they're preparing, but Rubio today said that the minerals deal with Ukraine should not be considered as a security guarantee for Ukraine. So it's quite the opposite what Trump's administration had been saying for the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
And Zelensky was denying it. He said it's not the security guarantee. I think the European allies agreeing how many troops they are ready to send to Ukraine, what weapons they are ready to send to Ukraine. It will show us how really they are determined to bring real security for Ukraine. But also, I would say the Ukrainian army is the best security guarantee for Ukraine. And if there is a ceasefire, then European allies should focus on strengthening Ukraine's defense capabilities, sending more weapons and more air defenses. I also want to add that there is a danger in the ceasefire with Russia, that it just prolongs into another ceasefire and another ceasefire without a real peace deal. And in that period of time, Russia could use this disinformation and all those campaigns to destabilize Ukrainian political situation. Also, the soldiers who have been fighting for over 3 years, they would want to go home and have some rest. And maybe there will be calls for elections from the US and Russia. So it will be very difficult for Ukraine to live through those ceasefires. That's why Zelensky was insisting that security guarantees should be forced, that Putin won't just renew the fighting in any convenient for him moment.
Yes. And Sergey, the US administration right now seems convinced that if there was an election that Zelensky would lose. At least that's what Elon Musk seems to be tweeting on the hoof anyway. Is that true? And especially after that Oval Office bust up, has Zelensky's popularity taken a hit?
I don't think that from the Ukrainian polls we can draw those conclusions quite yet. Clearly, the Trump administration have considered Zelensky to be an obstacle to peace, just as the Russians have. And there's a certain meeting of minds, or there has been in the last few weeks, about this about this notion that perhaps Zelensky should step aside and allow somebody else take the wheel, so to speak. But that's been a long time, Putin obsession. He has long refused to negotiate with Zelensky, and he has called Zelensky illegitimate, and so on and so forth. So when recently President Trump also joined this sort of narrative that was being peddled by Putin, I was surprised. But of course, President Trump is known for sharp reversals. If you can say one thing and call, Zelensky dictator and unelected, etc., on one day, and the next day seek to strike a deal with him. So I don't know that that President Trump will try to move any further on the road to delegitimize Zelensky or remove him from office. And in fact, even if he did that, I'm not sure that he has the necessary leverage to prevail. I mean, how do you even see that? America trying to remove an actually elected president of Ukraine, democratically elected president, acting together with Russia to remove him because they think he's an obstacle to peace. I don't see this working out. But it seems, at least from the recent discussions in Saudi Arabia, that the Americans have kind of patched up their relations with the Ukrainians, at least for the time being, and seem to be, at least briefly, on the same page.
And I will let you both go very soon. But Svitlana, just finally, Keir Starmer has been lauded almost as one of the leading diplomats in Europe, or at least in the European response to Trump's negotiations. Do you think the Prime Minister here has had much of a role in the situation that we are in today? Can he take any credit?
Of course, and he should. And as we know, Keir Starmer has been advising Zelensky how to deal with Trump prior these negotiations that led to American aid being resumed for Ukraine, which was very successful negotiation. And also, I think that the UK has shown such an important role in these 3 years of war, because Britain was the first to send heavy armored tanks to Ukraine, then all of the Europe followed, the first to send long-range missiles, and then all of the Europe followed. And the same goes with this peacekeeping mission, that Britain shows the lead and then all the Europe follows, and hopefully they can agree on something substantial.
Now it's time to talk about Scottish independence. Has the dream of Scottish independence collapsed along with Nicola Sturgeon's political career? Stuart McDonald discusses this with Lucy Dunn and James Heale.
The big news, of course, Lucy, is that Nicola Sturgeon has announced she will be standing down from her constituency at the next election in May 2026. Talk us through why now, the timing behind this.
So after quite a lot of speculation, because journalists have been asking for quite a while now whether Nicola Sturgeon will stay on at 2026 or leave, this morning she posted an Instagram post to let everyone know that she would be stepping down next year at the election. It's come at a time after 26 years of being in the Scottish Parliament. She was one of the 99ers elected at the very first Scottish Parliament election. She has had quite a tumultuous past couple of years, and she talked today when she was being interviewed about her mixed emotions. She's sort of sad but relieved as well to be leaving, and I think she also nodded towards having some regrets potentially about the last 18 months. But we do know that she has got a memoir coming out in the summer, so she's got lots of other things to keep her occupied. But yeah, certainly it's quite an interesting moment given just how big a figure Nicola Sturgeon is in Scottish politics. And I think, no matter where you stand on the subject of independence, Nicola Sturgeon is a formidable politician, and I think she really has left her mark on Scottish politics.
Stuart, the obvious question, what will Nicola Sturgeon's legacy be?
It's a good question. As Lucy mentioned, she's been around a long, long time, first in opposition, then at the highest levels of government. I think the, post-referendum, the SNP had this amazing surge in membership. Nicola becomes leader. I mean, it could have fallen apart at that point, right? But it didn't. And she sort of marshalled together a coalition of voters that allowed her to keep winning elections in a way that, the former leader before her had got the referendum and we came close, but not close enough. But she'd marshalled together a coalition of voters that cemented the SNP. I mean, it looks like we might go into our third decade in power.
Extraordinary.
Next year. Possibly, right? A lot can happen between now and then. And I think cementing that coalition of people post-referendum will be her legacy. There's loads of kind of individual policies, good, bad, and the ugly that we can talk about. But I think what she managed to do with the with the party post-referendum, bringing together, especially during that Brexit period where she became the kind of main anti-Brexit figure in Britain, helped in part by Jeremy Corbyn being so useless on the issue. She was described by the Daily Mail as the most dangerous woman in Britain. And she was just absolutely at the top of her game at those points. Didn't get there on independence, and I think her judgment went a bit towards the end on the independence question. But I think she can look back at her career with a healthy degree of satisfaction.
And Lucy, I'm kind of struck because, of course, remember the day when she resigned as First Minister? You were in the office then, and we had, I think, 45 minutes to write a cover and a Google Doc. I think 5 different people filing in, etc. Nicola's last favour to the Spectator. But because, as Stuart says, precisely, she was such a dominant figure. And, you know, I was up in the Scottish Daily Mail, the Scottish lobby at times in 2019 where it felt inevitable there was going to be the big push, etc. She almost, in the last 18 months, has almost disappeared from the scene. And I just wonder what you can say about her post-first ministerial career, what she's been up to over the past 18 months or so, because she kind of dropped off the radar a little bit, perhaps.
I thought it was interesting today that she says one of the things she's going to miss the most are her constituents and representing them, because, you know, arguably she hasn't done that much of that since she stepped down as First Minister in terms of looking at her spoken contributions in Holyrood. For example, it's very much in the single figures. You could, I think, count them in one hand. And I suppose in many ways, because of the Operation Branchform police probe into the SNP's funding and finances, really honing in on Nicola Sturgeon. She was arrested in 2023. Her now ex-husband has been charged with embezzlement of funds. That has really played in, I suppose, to maybe wanting to take a slight step back, probably for the sake of the party as well. You know, looking at how the polls took a real dip after Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, the subsequent infighting that the SNP leadership contest saw, and that played out on TV in a TV debate. Not really the best place for that all to sort of come to the fore. But also, I think there's real lack of trust now as to people looking at what they thought was a once very unified party with a strong leader, sort of watching it crumble in real time on real life TV type thing. It's really not, I think, where Nicola Sturgeon wanted to leave the party, and so it probably does make sense to take a slight step back.
And Stuart, how will the current SNP leadership sort of regard Nicola Sturgeon now she's going to be leaving Parliament? Because, of course, John Swinney served with her in Cabinet for many years. But is there a sense perhaps of wanting to move on post-Sturgeon, post-Salmon and all the sort of rows of the late 2010s?
Yeah, I think it's one of the healthiest things that the party can now do. And I've written this in previous pieces for The Spectator. It needs to move on from the Salmon Sturgeon era, which goes back to 2004, right? I mean, they grabbed the party by the neck and modernised it, made it sellable to the voters, got it into government, got a referendum, and, you know, everything else that happened from that. It now needs to move on and redefine itself, not in the shadow of its former leaders. And she has an opportunity now to, I mean, sure, she stood down as First Minister a while ago now, but she's leaving Parliament altogether. She has an opportunity to shape what a former SNP First Minister should be, because the first former SNP First Minister, the late Alex Salmond, who obviously was a phenomenal political figure, did become problematic for the party. The Russia Today TV show, and then the feud between him and Nicola Sturgeon that I don't particularly want to dwell on too much. But she now has the opportunity to go and be a bit like Jack McConnell, the former Labour First Minister, who only really gets into politics on rare occasions, does a lot of good charitable work. I suspect you'll see her do more of the book tours, and she's got her own book coming out, as Lucy mentions. But the party now needs to move on from that period. That will be a healthy thing. And I think following the death of Alex Salmond late last year, now with Nicola Sturgeon departing politics altogether, I hope that one thing that goes with both of them is this idea that the fortunes of the party are so strongly tied to the leader or former leader of the party. It needs to break out of that. And I think that John Swinney, Kate Forbes, as the leaders of the current SNP government, have got a real chance to shape what that would look like.
And Lucy, talk us through the next 14 months then and moving forward, because, of course, A few weeks ago, it was the Scottish Labour conference, and it seems that Anas Sarwar's speech went down reasonably well, and a bit of a reset on that. But of course, that's the big thing that everyone's contending with now is post-July, as the Scottish Labour's poll ratings have collapsed, and the SNP, now, as Stuart said earlier, incredibly heading for a potential third decade in power.
Yeah, I think we saw at the start of the year that Scottish Labour was getting about sort of predicted 18% in the polls, which would be pretty abysmal for them, given the sort of landslide that we saw last July with Keir Starmer. At the Scottish Labour conference, I think the reports that came out of that were that the party are definitely more optimistic than what the polls are predicting just now. I think their sort of stance is that they're still quite a long way off from this Holyrood election. A lot can change, as we well know, in sort of 14 to 18 months. But I suppose on the sort of SNP front, what's interesting is we had this exodus of SNP MPs in July last year, and the question, well, the question is,
and we're delighted to be joined in one of the studios.
And how many of those MPs or ex-MPs will want to go up and be in the front line in Holyrood. And we're seeing Nicola Sturgeon as the 25th MSP to announce that she's standing down at the 2026 Holyrood election. That's out of 18 SNP MSPs at the moment, 19 if you include John Mason, who's an independent at present. And so I think the makeup of the party post-26 will be really interesting. And as Stuart was talking about, how it then reforms and moves forward in a vision that is not so much tied to either Nicola Sturgeon or Alex Salmond.
Yeah, I mean, Stuart, how does the party look like in the next parliament? How will it sort of rejuvenate itself with those new characters?
Well, look, we've had in the past week Nicola Sturgeon leaving, Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Minister, leaving, Shona Robertson, Cabinet Minister, leaving. That's over 75 years of parliamentary experience just between those three figures. So it will be a wildly different party, a wildly different parliament. And the reason why this is happening at the minute is the party is currently selecting. It's in the process of vetting candidates. People will start, I think, from as soon as next week, if I'm not mistaken, to go out there. You can tell I'm not doing it. To go out there and pitch themselves to constituency parties to get selected. But it will be wholly different, and that's a good thing, because if the central aim of the SNP is Scottish statehood, then it needs to look, sound and feel different to how it did in 2014. And the generation of people, John Swinney, Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, Fiona Hislop, Angus Robertson, who really brought the party up and got victory in 2007, got the referendum in 2014. It's time for a new generation to reshape and remould that party going into the future. So 2026, the selections will be interesting. They're already a bit spicy, but I think it's going to be a wildly, wildly different parliamentary party to what we've seen before.
And Stuart, if there is any sort of young, thrusting Scottish national activist listening to this and they were going for selection, what advice would you give them if you were making a speech next week?
Make sure that you get across what it is you actually believe in. One of the things all parties are guilty of this, by the way, is they focus on how many leaflets did you deliver during the by-election recently and all of this kind of rubbish. We need people of substance. We need people with ideas. We need people with ideas now to solve some of the big problems in Scotland. How does the party move forward on its central aim of Scottish independence? None of this is easy, and it's going to take people with ideas, with a bit of bravery, with a bit of personality. And the other thing I would say is get off social media, go outside, touch grass, meet voters, talk to real people.
And penultimately, Keir Starmer has wrong-footed quite a few Conservatives this week by announcing that he would getting rid of NHS England. Is Keir Starmer, the famous socialist Prime Minister, turning into a slasher of government? James Heale, again, and Madeline Grant talk about what's going on with Keir Starmer.
Tell us what you thought of the big speech.
Well, the first thing is to say is that I was not actually there in person, because Keir Starmer's government are operating, I think, a sort of slightly different policy towards press access, where they often only admit one person per outlet. And frankly, the sketch writers are not really deemed important enough to make the cut. So I keep having to do these things from the TV, which is a shame, because I think to really sketch something, it's better to be in the room to get the general atmosphere. But this is something we've become quite familiar with, especially on a Thursday, which is often a quieter day in Parliament. That's when they send Keir Starmer up and down the country to alas for them, meet with members of the general public and sometimes to make some kind of an announcement. Last week he was in a dockyard in Birkenhead talking about defence. This week there was actually something more substantial came out of it, which was the axing of NHS England. But before we got to that point, there was, as ever, a lengthy preamble, some sound bites, some agonising football metaphors chucked into there. So it was all very Starmer until it wasn't.
I mean, Maddie, how long have you been sketching Keir Starmer from now? Is it about 4 years?
Yes, it must be 4 and a bit years. Yes, because when I began, it was actually in the middle of lockdown. So it was Boris Johnson versus Keir Starmer. And that was a very odd time to sketch because often there was, hardly anyone was in the chamber at all and people were zooming in. So yes, it's been 4 and a bit years.
And how has his style changed over that? I mean, you have my sympathies, and I imagine many of the viewers, in trying to find something new and funny and interesting to say about Sir Keir, who is not known perhaps as one of nature's natural narrators.
Well, I mean, I think recently I've noticed he has become, I think, a bit more confident. Some would say confident, others would say arrogant or cocky. For example, when he was asked about, I think one of the journalists asked, is this a return to austerity? And he had said, no, it's not. Presumably that's because he's doing it as opposed to a Tory doing it. I think that you don't come out with things like this unless you really think that you have full control and that you're absolutely killing it. One thing that I find really quite depressing is if you go back and look at old videos of old parliamentary debates, interviews on the TV, people speak in joined up sentences. They might mention football. I don't know. I can't remember people mentioning football 30, 40 years ago, but it's not the only thing that they seem to ever mention. Literally the only reference they have, the only hinterland that they have is to do with football. You kind of half wonder, is this because he genuinely is only interested in football and destroying the country? Or is it that he's has someone told him that this does well in focus groups? People love it when you mention football, Keir. It makes you a man of the people. Just keep doing it.
Well, I think you've been pointing out actually online, Maddie, about how there was a point, I think, towards the election last year where Keir Starmer almost seemed this void where he was unable to say if he had a favourite book, what his favourite book was. And so football was almost like the only thing, like he likes a pint and football. And it was a sort of creature allegedly sort of invented by Morgan McSweeney and the bright stars of Labour together, as it were, because it did seem at points he seemed unable to talk about anything other than football, wasn't it?
Yes. And the odd thing is that he actually does truly love football. But even so, when he talks about football, that too sounds robotic. I'm reminded of one of my favourite Simpsons episodes, which is when the two aliens, Kang and Kodos, adopt the disguises of Bob Dole and Bill Clinton for the, I guess that would have been the...
96.
Is that the 1994?
96. It was 96 Bob Dole.
Thank you, James. I knew you would know. That they're trying to give political sound bites, but obviously they're aliens. So they say things like, I am looking forward to a free and fair election instead of a bloodbath. I get a bit of that with Keir talking about football. It sounds like a droid talking about football, I'm afraid.
And tell me about your favourite sketches over the time. I mean, you've been sent, obviously most of the time you're in Parliament, but you've been sent various places. I wonder what one of the most memorable occasions you've had to cover.
Alas, I was actually not able to get outside for Rishi Sunak in the main announcing the general election. I made it to the number 10 security booth, and then there were a whole bunch of us that just missed the cut, and then they shut the doors and we couldn't go in. So that was a pity. But although I think I would have died of secondhand cringe if I had been there, it might have been. I found the general election campaign, it was the first one that I had done, really fascinating, getting sent all over the country to different sorts of events. I absolutely loved going to the Green Party launch in Bristol. It was in a very, very leafy, beautiful area of Bristol, and the assortment of assembled Green Party members were just amazing. It was absolutely everything you could want from the Green Party manifesto launch. And then I had to go to a field, was it an airbase or something in Devon, to watch Rishi Sunak giving a really awkward speech in front of all this heavy machinery. That they absolutely love any kind of backdrop, especially if they think it kind of fits in with their general goals. I've noticed Starmer has started doing this a lot more. He'll be like, today I'm here to talk about defence, and it will be like a dockyard, and he'll always have his sleeves rolled up to show that he's like ready for business. I mean, I think it looks like he's about to do the dishes, but you know.
Was it Still It Bang? You said was the headline on your Telegraph piece.
Yes, because of the dishes. Yeah, he just made me think of that chap, Barry Scott. Do you remember him? Hi, I'm Scott. I don't know why, it just made me think of that. And also the bored expression on the people behind him, because that's the other difficulty. There's a kind of like Greek chorus of silent characters who just have to stand there and listen. It's usually employees of the business, and it's kind of difficult for them to know what to do, because there was one woman who was standing in the background of, I think it was Rishi at the airbase, and she kept kind of jiggling from foot to foot because I guess she'd been standing for a long time and she was tired, but it just looked like she was dancing. And you don't want to yawn, but you also don't want to nod or smile. So they just have to stand there looking very expressionless.
I think Greek chorus is a good way of describing it. I mean, yesterday it was quite something to watch the initially beaming women behind him have sort of rictus grins by the end of it as the thing, how much longer is this going to go on? I mean, This speech was billed as sort of Operation Chainsaw. It might actually be sort of Operation Toothpick by the end of it. What did you make of Sir Keir's attempts to cosplay as Javier Milei?
Well, you know what? Credit where it's due. It was a pointless layer of bureaucracy, and you know it must be really quite humiliating for Conservatives to look at this and see the Labour government that they detest doing some of the things that they tried or promised and it never materialised over the years. Do I think that Keir Starmer is a natural Javier Milei? Do I think he's going to Afuera, the Women Equalities Department or whatever? No. I don't think that's why he and his cabinet have come into politics. I think that there has clearly been a change of direction, and one that is going better for them. I mean, I just think though you have to look at the accompanying direction of travel. This is a government that has also managed to establish, I think, sort of 27, I think is the number of task forces, quangos, arm's length bodies, and there are some really funny ones. I love the Regulatory Innovation Office. It's like the one that regulates the regulators who regulate innovation. And the Office for Value for Money is hilarious too, because we already have we have the National Audit Office that already does a similar-ish thing, you'd think. So what's the point? But it's a good start, and this was the single biggest quango, so that is credit where it's due.
And Maddie, I just think as a final question, if you were to go from poacher to gamekeeper, what advice would you give Keir Starmer in how he can improve his speeches and make them even better sketches in the papers the next day?
Okay, so I'm now his advisor, am I?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Okay, I'm Morgan McSween, and I'm telling him how he could make it funnier for us to sketch.
Funnier or better, or just more watchable, shall we say?
Better. Well, to be honest, I really enjoy sketching Keir Starmer because I disagree with probably 98% of what he's doing. I find that there's something about his voice that kind of shatters my soul. I find there's a kind of rich seam of contempt that I can tap into for sketching him. So for me, he's already the perfect target. It's much harder to sketch people who, you sort of half agree with them. Sketches where you agree with them are no fun at all. And sometimes your readers get annoyed if you're sketching people that they like and you've done it in a unpleasant way. But I genuinely think that our job is not to make friends. We're there to puncture the egos of the people in charge. So in a way, Keir Starmer's perfect. The other thing I love about Keir Starmer is that he has absolutely no idea why people laugh at him, why he's funny. So when he said he got so angry during the general election campaign because the audience laughed at "My father was a toolmaker," and he's like, "My father would have been disgusted if he heard this." And it's like, no, they weren't laughing at your father, they were laughing at you because you just keep saying the same thing over and again, which is inherently funny.
Yes, I think sometimes repetition can become self-parody, can't it, Maddie? But we're lucky we can't say the same thing about your excellent column. So
thank you.
Thank you very much. We look forward to reading you next in the Telegraph, and thank you for joining us very much on Spectator TV today.
And finally, Natasha Feroze and Katy Faust talk about whether we need more children's rights. The answer, of course, is no.
Katy, just to begin with, that to me, children's rights movement seems so obvious, and any parent surely would want the children's rights to go first. So why, just for our viewers that have no idea about you, but why do we need a children's rights movement?
Well, first of all, we need to properly define what we mean by children's rights. Unfortunately, that label has been co-opted and adulterated by leftist progressives to try to smuggle in all kinds of child-destroying ideologies.
Yeah.
So they will say that children have a right to sexual pleasure, or children have a right to have a transgender identity hidden from their parents at school, or something like that. Children do not have fundamental rights to either of those things. They do have a fundamental right to life. They have a fundamental right to be known and loved by their mother and father. That is recognized in the most widely ratified treaty in the world, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, of which the UK is a party. So these are not obscure, I'm not making this up. These are widely acknowledged throughout the world. So when we're looking at children's right within the family, their right to be known and loved by the two people responsible for their existence, if that genuinely is a right, number one, it really should inform and shape all of our conversations about marriage, family, divorce, modern families, same-sex parenting, reproductive technologies, and adoption. And number two, when we properly understand children's natural rights, we know that they perfectly reinforce natural parental rights as well. So properly defining rights is going to give us the answers that we need to move forward and address a lot of these major cultural issues that we're battling today.
So have you found, when you've made this movement and tried to talk about it and advocate for children's rights, a lot of people are saying, oh, so are you talking about children having the rights to have puberty blockers?
Yes.
Because, yeah.
Yes. We do have to do a little bit of corrective work to begin with, right off the bat. But we made it a very strategic decision to not say children's interests or children's needs. These are fundamental natural rights that children have. And unfortunately, our civil law may not recognize them, but that doesn't mean that they go away. We discern and we understand what natural rights are by looking at the natural world. These are universal moral truths that are going to be a reality, whether you live in, the United Kingdom, whether you live in Nebraska, whether you live in South Africa. These, because they are grounded in fundamental human realities, these are natural laws that can be applied to all children at all times, throughout the world.
One of the ways that you say that children's rights become eroded, and you talk about this a lot, is through divorce and the increase in no-fault divorce. What are, obviously, no-fault divorce is one type of category, but what are the main reasons in America and elsewhere that people get divorced these days?
I think that there's a conception, probably perpetuated by media and a handful of stories, that divorce is necessary because of abuse. And it is true, that most civil law and even religious communities have allowed for separation at minimum and often divorce in the name of abuse or extreme cruelty. And there is a time to separate, at least, if not divorce. And in those cases, I think it's very important to punish the abuser. That's really what needs to take place, is there needs to be a reward and a surrounding of support of the innocent spouse, and there needs to be punishment, both socially and criminally, for those that are perpetuating the abuse. But that's not the majority of why divorces take place, especially in the United States today. About 70%, maybe 2/3, depending on the survey you're looking at, of divorces break up low conflict marriages. Marriages where nobody is at fault. It wasn't adultery, it wasn't abuse, it wasn't addiction, it wasn't abandonment. It was, we fell out of love, or we're having communication difficulties, or maybe there's a porn use issue. All things that are really significant issues, but not necessarily because mother or father or child is in danger. So what we did is we took divorce out of the realm of saying you are at fault of breaking your marital vows, your covenant, your contract, if you want to put it that way. And in essence, we moved it to the place where anyone can leave a relationship for any time and there's no breach of contract. Unfortunately, what that means is standards for marriage are lowered, lower barriers getting in, easier barriers getting out, fewer marriages taking place. And of course, it is the children who experience the lifelong harms when their two parents, to whom they have a natural right, who are statistically the most connected to, invested in, and protective of them, are living in two different homes.
Could you tell some more stories about that? Because every time, and your book has a lot of anecdotes in, which is really good to contextualize everything. But anyone that I know that's got divorced, all they ever say is the children are going to come first. So what they might be saying and their actions could be different, and maybe you could talk about that. But surely any parent in a divorce wants their child to be prioritized and what their needs and wants are.
Yeah. So children we don't have to guess about what children need. And we have much more than just anecdotes, even though it is important to have the anecdotes. We do need to tell the stories of children who have experienced split homes, 2 different lives, the instability that goes along with that. But we don't have to guess at the issues with divorce. We have been studying it for decades. And what we see is there are physical harms that go along, genuine impacts to children's physical health when their parents divorce. There are emotional harms, there are academic harms, and there are long-term relational harms for kids. So just for example, even if you have a good divorce, even if you think, oh, if I'm happy, my kids will be happy. There was a study done in 2017 that studied the telomeres, that is the end caps of a child's chromosomes, that are in every cell of a child's body. And what they saw is that when children lose a parent, lose a father to death, incarceration, or divorce, it shortens the child's telomeres. It literally impacts every cell of their body. What do telomeres do? Well, they're responsible for health and longevity. And so what we see is, not surprisingly, children whose parents divorce, even if it's a low conflict divorce, even if the parents remain friends, even if they end up going into other household arrangements or marriages that seem to be tranquil, we still see that children suffer physically from that. We see that children of divorce have higher rates of long-term chronic illnesses. They have increased problems with their skin, their gut, their urinary organs. And so we have a direct correlation between diminished physical health for children and divorce. So even if you think, well, I'm going to handle this emotionally well, your child's body is going to receive it as a blow, and it really is going to implicate, at least put them at increased risk for all kinds of long-term medical issues.
Is there statistics around it affecting girls and boys differently?
So what we see is that father loss impacts girls and boys differently. So I talk about father loss because that's typically what takes place. If there is going to be a disconnection or a disassociation with one parent, it is typically the non-residential parent. Typically, mothers are awarded primary custody or sole custody in some cases, and children will lose contact with their non-residential parent, usually the father, after 2 years. Not all of them. 40% of children will lose total contact with their father 40% after 2 years. And so what happens, like what's the impact of father loss, whether it's through divorce or maybe the parents just never married, maybe it's a single mother situation. So what we see in those situations of fatherlessness is an almost predictable patterns in boys and girls. Girls tend to experiment earlier with sexual relationships. In fact, we see, again, a measurable difference in the girl's body. On average, girls who are raised apart from their biological father will experience their first period 1 year earlier than girls who are raised in the home of their biological dad. Yeah. There's several theories about why that is, but something about having no father in the home or foreign pheromones of mother's boyfriend or a stepfather that initiates an early reproductive cycle in the girl. Couple that with the likely father hunger that she is experiencing, because all little girls long for, are made for, and desire to be cherished by a man. And if the man is not her father, who is offering that kind of protective guidance, she will find a man to love her. It just might be for 5 minutes on a Friday night. That is why 63% of girls in the United States who have teen pregnancies come from fatherless homes, right? Not only because they're reproductively ready, but they're vulnerable to the wrong kind of male attention. Boys who don't grow up with a father. Brad Wilcox just unveiled this astounding finding in his book, Get Married. He found that if a boy grows up without a father, he is more likely to go to prison than graduate from college. That is the impact of a fatherless home on a boy. Criminality is the more predictable result for boys. Why is that? Because fathers are distinctly wired to regulate a child's aggression, specifically a boy's aggression. And if they do not have a father in the home wrestling with them when they are age 4, arm wrestling with them when they're age 6, building and chopping and climbing trees, if they don't have a father that is channeling that aggressive, that competitiveness, sometimes the first time they run into that kind of physical boundary is with the police. And unfortunately, that's not the right place to test out your aggressiveness. They will find somebody like the girls. They will find a man to love them and shape them and guide them. And a lot of times it's a gang leader, somebody that is going to use them to advance their own aims. So fatherlessness is really at the heart of most of the social ills that we're facing in America, certainly in the UK too. I know that right now you have, I think 50% of the children in the UK will reach their 14th birthday in a fractured home, right? So you guys have a pretty alarming rate of family breakdown taking place, and that does not bode well for your young sons and your young daughters.
And what about homosexual couples that end up going on to have children? Obviously, if you wouldn't mind expanding on your own experience with your parents getting divorced.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we do a lot of critiquing of modern families that them before us. Modern family is just code for child loss. The child has to lose something to be in that family, and that is going to harm the child. And you can.
Katy, but how have they lost something when they may not know? I understand the statistics you're bringing in, but these children are born without this person. So how have they lost something that they never even knew that they had?
Yeah, because they have it, right? Every child, no matter how modern we want to talk about family, no matter what kinds of modern technologies where we can assemble children in petri dishes, no matter how we modernize our parenthood laws or modernize our definition of infertility so that the state can subsidize motherless and fatherless children, children refuse to modernize. They refuse to be able to be created without the influence and the participation of one man and one woman. Children still require a man and a woman for their life to begin. And then statistically, it still is very, very clear from all of the data that one man and one woman are statistically the most likely to ensure that the child is safe and loved. There is something about that biological connection that advantages children in terms of investment of time, investment of resources, increased protectiveness, increased connectedness, increased belonging. And we know this because we have studied unrelated adults in the home. And we see that whenever there's an unrelated adult in the home, rates of abuse and neglect skyrocket. And so there's no question, if you're actually looking at the data, that you are disadvantaged when you are separated from your mother and father. So now let's talk about same-sex parenting. What is same-sex parenting from the child's perspective? It is always the loss of one biological parent, which is going to increase the likelihood that children are going to struggle with identity issues because only those two adults, a child's mother and father, grant them something that they crave, which is their biological identity. You know, children have a very hard time answering the question, who am I? If they cannot answer the question, whose am I? We know this because adoptees very often go on to look for and search for their birth mother. 94% of adoptees want to know which parent they resemble the most. The vast majority want to know why they were given up for adoption. Now we have surveys on sperm and egg donor conceived adults who feel the same way. At minimum, they want accurate medical records, but a lot of the times they want to know, do I look like you? Do you like to play the piano like me? Are you also an engineer, and are you mechanically minded? These are not questions that their own social parents or even adoptive parents are able to answer for them, and they deeply matter to kids. And then same-sex parented homes are always going to be missing either the maternal or paternal love that maximizes child development. Fathers advantage children in ways that mothers don't. And just to circle back to my story, as you alluded, I'm saying this not because I'm saying lesbians can be bad, that they're bad mothers, or gay people are bad fathers. Absolutely not. My mother's been in a relationship with her partner since, for 40 years. So I spent most of my adolescence splitting time between the home of my father and the home of my mother and her partner. My mother was a better mother than your mother. My mother might be a better mother than I am. She's a fantastic mother. Her sexual attractions do not determine whether or not she is a good mother, but her biology does. And neither she nor her partner could ever be a father to me. And that's the problem. The problem is that when there's two men raising a child, that child is always missing a mother, and neither of those men will be able to function as a mother. When there's two women raising a child, the child is always missing a father. Neither of them, no matter how butch or short hair or masculine they present themselves to be, will ever meet that child's need for a father.
I remember when I've watched an interview with you before, and this is whoever is the other parent is obviously in some regards a step parent.
That's right.
And one of the interviews I watched of you before was talking about step parents. And for any of our viewers that don't understand this, I wonder if you could talk about the Cinderella effect and the dangers of it.
Yeah, Wilson and Daly did extensive research. They were two Canadian sociologists who studied, I think, between the years of 1976 and 1991, rates of deadly child abuse in Canada. And what they found is stepfathers were 140 times, not 140%, 140 times more likely to be responsible for the death of a child in their home than the child's own genetic father. So we have all of these perceptions that, oh, fathers are dangerous and, there's abuse within biological homes. There can be, but there's no improvement with any other form of family structure. And I often tell people, you can fact check me on this, because we have been so accustomed to say that biology doesn't matter, love makes a family, or kids don't need a mom and dad, they just need two parents, or if the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. Well, if all of those things are true, then children who are living with their mother and her cohabiting boyfriend would be doing great, because they've got two parents, the adults are happy, they even have a mother and a father figure. So I challenge people, Google the words mother's boyfriend right now. You can pause this interview right now and tell me, what do you see? What are all the returns when you Google mother's boyfriend? And you're going to see things like mother's boyfriend ties daughter to the bed and beats her to death. Mother's boyfriend cuts child up and stuffs them in a suitcase. Mother's boyfriend responsible for the beating death of an infant. Mother's boyfriend arraigned on charges because they suffocated the baby, or whatever it is. So mother's boyfriend, and I would just generalize that and say any unrelated man sharing living spaces with the child, especially left to care for the child alone, is statistically the most dangerous person in a child's life. And what we are doing in Modern Family is, in essence, normalizing, promoting, and incentivizing unrelated adults to be sharing living spaces with children.
And there's even Reddit groups where these step parents go on and say, I hate my stepchildren. What do I do about them? They're awful.
Yeah. Yes, it's hard to raise children, and it's hard to have patience with your own child. But biology does allow a level of protection and connectivity that simply intending to parent or simply being in a romantic relationship with the child's biological parent, that it just doesn't provide. And I'm not saying that there aren't wonderful, heroic step-parents out there, because there are. But many of them have to overcome significant barriers to be that wonderful step-parent. It is not biologically wired in either the child or the adult to bond completely with a biological stranger. You are, in essence, working against many of the systems established, whether it's, through an evolutionary explanation or a religious perspective, that we really do have these kinship bonds that aid in connection, protection, and attachment. So it's not impossible to form those bonds with an unrelated child, but because there's additional barriers, that's the exact reason why adoptive parents like me, and probably like a lot of your listeners, have to go through extensive screening and background checks. Because social workers are not idiots. And they know that it takes more than saying, I want a baby, I intend to parent this baby, to actually treat that baby as if they had been born to you. Yeah, it cannot be raise the population at any cost. The solution to the population problem cannot be commodification and dehumanization of the very children that we say that we are welcoming into society. In fact, I would say a child-centric understanding is probably the way forward, because if you understand that sex makes babies, and that those babies have a right to the two people who created them through sex, those children have a right to life. Honestly, if you solved your abortion problem, you would solve a lot of your demographic problem. That's a child-centric view, right? That adoption, sorry. Yes. So I think that I heard it said that you had, James Orr was just telling me, your abortion rates, what are they like?
500,000.
Yes, about 550,000
a year.
Yeah. Okay. And so there's part of your demographic problem right now. A child-centric understanding says children have a fundamental right to life. You cannot force them out of existence just because they are unwanted. So then a child-centric understanding of reproductive technology says children have a right to life and they have a right to their mother and father. You cannot force them into existence if they are very wanted, especially if it means that Many children will lose their right to life in the process, or maybe they will lose their mother or father in the process. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are in the UK, but in the United States, we lose about 1 million lives to abortion every year. It's a safe bet that 4 million are lost to IVF every year. And so we have this idea that reproductive technologies, IVF, surrogacy, it's all about making babies. It's not. When we look at what it is in practice, IVF and surrogacy is about on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide, usually upon the pile of dozens of dead babies who are being donated to research, left in a freezer, or discarded as medical waste. So these are not, neither of these worlds, the baby taking industry or the baby making industry, are child-centric. We need to get back to the place where we respect that children should be welcomed into the world, that anytime you are consenting to sex, you're consenting to parenthood, and then you protect that fundamental little life, whether it's unwanted or very wanted.
And obviously this is part of Mary Harrington's argument that part of the problem with having the pill is that you can have this carefree sex. But I suppose I hear you about the 500,000 abortions a year, and that really shocked me when I heard that statistic. Although anyone that I know that's had an abortion, it's been because they wouldn't give this child a child-centric life. So what do you do about that?
Yeah. The answer to any question of what do you do in any marriage or family question is always the same. Either the adults are going to sacrifice or the child is going to sacrifice. Let's look at some of those situations. There's an unplanned pregnancy. The woman maybe wants the baby, maybe the guy doesn't want the baby. Okay, what is the solution? The solution is that mother and father both sacrifice to protect the child's right to life and right to their mother and father. Because what is the alternative? The child sacrifices their life, or they sacrifice their right to their mother and father, and that's an injustice. So the solution in an unplanned pregnancy is the adult's sacrifice to protect the child. What about in a struggling marriage? Okay. Well, the answer there is someone is going to sacrifice. It will either be the adults who figure out the communication issues, the financial challenges, or the pornography addiction, work it out and sacrifice so the child can continue to live in both of their, with both of their parents in the same home with all of the attending physical, mental, emotional, academic, and relational benefits. Or the children will sacrifice. Somebody's going to do the hard thing there. It will be the adults or the child. What about in a situation of somebody who identifies as gay or lesbian? Somebody is going to, and maybe they would be a wonderful father or mother.
Yeah.
Somebody is going to sacrifice. Either the child will sacrifice their right to their mother or father so the adult can form a family around their romantic attractions, or the gay or lesbian adult will sacrifice their attractions and build a family in a way where the child is raised by both their married mother and father, loving each other and loving them. So in all of these marriage and family questions, it's not a matter of, oh, it's easy, no one's doing the hard thing. It's usually a matter of the adults are going to take the easy path and the child will have to do the hard thing. And that's a society characterized by injustice.
Back to adoption, I wanted to ask you partly about your own personal story because you adopted a Chinese boy.
Yes.
Aged, how old is he?
He's 15 now.
He's 15 now.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask what the experience is of having your own biological children and then having an adopted child, and whether, has it ever been a moment where you thought it might be harder for the adoptive child to experience that you also have your own biological children at the same time?
Yeah, I of course, before I adopted, I had been in the adoption world. I did not have any rose-colored glasses that this was going to fix all the problems. In fact, especially because he was older and because he has a special need, because he was in an institution for the first 2 years of his life, we were prepared for the possibility that this could be very challenging, and it was. It was challenging for him because he was starved in the first 2 years of his life in every way that a human can be starved, in terms of nutrition, in terms of connection, in terms of guidance, in terms of attachment, in terms of nurturing. So he came to us as a 2-year-old with some deficits that, to be quite honest, may never fully heal. And it was very challenging for him to then come into a home where there was obviously, I pray, lavish love, but also boundaries. And, as Erica Komisar talks about, those birth to 3, If you miss that window, you very often cannot get it back. And we miss that window. So what you see is children that do not have that kind of proper attachment with their mother struggle with things like trust, emotional regulation. It's interesting, we're here. I brought both of my sons, my 17 and 15-year-old, to the conference. And even now, he's been with us for 13 years, and I have never abandoned him. But I said, oh, hey, can you go grab this in the room before we head down? And he goes, okay, but don't leave me. He still will say, he still has this panic, like, oh my gosh, don't leave. My other 3 children never had those kinds of panics. They'd be like, yeah, I'm going to go grab this. My mom's not going to leave. She's still going to be right outside the hotel door waiting for me. So there really is this breaking, honestly, of what it means to be human in those very, very early years, that it's sometimes not, I'm not saying it can never happen, but if you miss that window, it's not like you can just get it back when they're 9 or 19 or 29. Very often they may have to override that internal panic all their life because they lost it. They lost it when they should have had it the most.
It's very interesting. My mum was adopted at 8 weeks, and we almost never talk about it. It's not something that she ever has shown any example of it affecting her, but she did say when we were on walks before, she hates being at the back. She's a very fast walker, and she did mention once, quite flippantly, I think it's something to do with like not being left behind. It was really profound when she said that, because it's just so strange how these things can affect you in such a small but significant way. I want to ask you about the age of adoption. Thinking about also my mum, she was adopted at 8 weeks, and some of the research we've been doing at the Spectator is whether, and perhaps this is quite controversial, the obsession with keeping a child with their biological parents comes eventually at the expense of them, because they are raised in a very vulnerable household, and care workers want to do everything they can to keep them with the child. But then you lose these essential 3 years in which a child can grow up and be in a happy, stable home. And should there be policies that are a bit stricter and perhaps end up taking a child away from a mother, away from a father earlier to save them? And then how do you square that with a child should always be with its biological mother and father?
There's 2 errors that you can fall into here. One is giving too much credence to what the biological parents want, and the other is giving too much credence to what the adoptive parents want. So the 2 errors are going to be adult-centric, adult-focused. Both of these cases, and in all of these situations, it has to elevate the primary interest of the child. Sometimes it is in the best interest of the child to be immediately and permanently removed from a biological parent, and then adopted as soon as possible, or at least after that right kind of like, have we actually examined the situation and understand that that should not be a home that the child should return to, and then place the child with adoptive parents rather than a revolving door of foster parents, for example, in the United States. The other error is saying, well, this is what the adults want, right? And we've actually had some arguments made in the States that, for example, LGBT couples or same-sex couples have a right to adopt, that this is their way to get kids, and they can't have kids any other way. And so we have a right to have an adopted child. And the answer is no.
It's homophobic if you say
it's homophobic
no,
if you don't. And the answer is no, you don't have a right to adopt a child. Because no adult has a right to a child that I didn't have a right to adopt my son. He had a right to be adopted. The system, the process, the evaluation is about him. It's not about me. So we have seen both of those errors in the United States, where unfortunately there's sort of a racial component in the United States where if, for example, there is a Black mother or a Hispanic family where there's abuse taking place, especially because mother's boyfriend is involved, and there isn't a Black home that you can place the child into, in some places they've thought, oh no, it will be bad for the child if they're raised by a white family or living in a white home, so the child has remained in the abusive home. So that is a very, unfortunately, an adult-centric mentality about that, rather than we need to make an immediate decision about this child's well-being and remove them from the home, regardless of how upset it makes this parent, and certainly placing children in the right home, regardless of how upset it makes some other intended parents. So it's just, these are very challenging situations, and unfortunately, sometimes they are subjective. How much is it going to harm the child if we remove them? How dangerous is this situation we're taking them away from? And that is why we need wonderful people in these positions that have a child-centric mindset about it. But when you're in these kinds of messy, adjudications. There is some subjectivity there, but always, whenever possible, you have to elevate the best interest of the child.
Couple more questions, Katy. So America's experienced a big change in politics.
Yeah.
You have Trump 2.0.
Yeah.
And the second most powerful man in the whole of the administration is Elon Musk.
You think so?
It feels that way. Do you not think so?
Well, I don't know. He hasn't been voted in, so I don't know. Does he have more power than any of the other people that have been appointed? I don't know.
Maybe it's just all rhetoric and talk.
Yeah,
and he's just got the loudest
voice. He certainly
voice.
has the biggest, the most, maybe even the largest persona. I'll totally give you that.
I mean, he definitely sets the tone on X, which has become so politicized, and
that is unequivocally true.
And he is. I think he's recently been accused of having his 13th child.
I think it's been confirmed.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think Donald Trump has been accused of having his own history with having several children from different women.
Also confirmed.
And I wanted to ask you about how you feel about having these leaders and how much there should be setting the example, of course, but also when you are around Americans and a lot of people, I think it would be fair to say, are feeling quite hopeful about this administration. I've heard a lot of pro-Trump, pro-Elon Musk narrative. And then actually you look at their backgrounds and you look at their family homes, based off what you're saying, they're not child-centric individuals.
That's right. They're not. So they cannot be elevated as moral examples.
No.
And they are not, certainly not Elon Musk. He doesn't claim to be, but I don't even think Trump does. They're not convictional conservatives. They are pragmatists. And Trump likes to win. And he understands what's popular. And he knows how to get things done. And thank goodness he seems to be more closely aligned with things like economic, historical and biological reality than the previous administration. And that has redounded to, I think, some pretty fantastic executive orders and appointments in his cabinet. Wonderful. When it comes to their own personal lives, I'm like, follow J.D. Vance, not Musk, not Trump.
Lastly, actually very similar to the J.D. Vance thing, because I think this brings in religion. And I read on your Substack that your daughter got married recently.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you quoted, and I can't remember it exactly, so I'll paraphrase, but I just wish that everyone saw when you have this line about the importance of marriage, I wish people took these honours seriously, took these oaths seriously.
Yeah.
And I wondered how much your book and your other books are possible and feasible in a society where actually religion is in decline.
So I don't know if religion is in decline. You just had a poll. I think was it the Times researchers that just did a poll like a week or two ago that said that your next generation of Gen Zers were half as likely to identify as atheists as their parents. And religion is making a comeback. In the United States, Bible sales are up 22%. Gen Z, the next generation, is taking a hard turn to the right politically, but also morally. Again, just last week there was a poll taken in the UK of 1,000 Zoomers that showed that they were rejecting hookups, anonymous hookups, much more than their millennial counterparts. They were watching less porn and they valued marriage more.
Not potentially from religion. That's actually
not potentially. That's just a rightward trend.
Yeah,
that's a rightward trend. And so I don't necessarily know if religion is on the decline. It certainly is. Up with the boomers, right? And then Gen Z, my generation, Gen X, somewhat. But I think religion is making a comeback. And that is because I think all of the woke ideology has proven itself to be utterly vacuous and led to meaninglessness and despair. And young people are turning towards something more substantive, and they're finding that in religion. We do see that, what I am observing in my world is that the religious are more eager to get married sooner and more likely to have more children. It certainly looks to me like economics is not going to get you out of the birth dearth. It has to be a better story about man, woman, marriage, children, a better story about, why are we here? What are we doing? And the importance of family that goes along with that. And religion does provide that better story.
And last question, I promise. What advice do you think you have for young boys and girls who might want to look for a happy marriage that they can stay in, not go through a divorce, and be child-centric. What do you think is the route to that sort of thing?
Well, everybody says that the divorce rate is 50%, but that is generally because a lot of people get married and divorced over and over and over again, so they skew the data for everybody else. If you are, if you don't shack up and you don't sleep around before you're married, if you have a thorough, deliberate dating process, if you then get married before you have children, and if you attend weekly religious services together, your divorce rate is below 10%. So you actually have a lot of control over whether or not your marriage lasts and whether or not your marriage is a happy one. Studies consistently show that highly religious conservative women have the best, most satisfying sex. And so like this idea that you're going to be locked up, that religion is some kind of jail for women, it's just not true. Religious men, highly religious men that are Christians and attend weekly services, report that their wives are the most happy. They help the most with housework. Married men in general tend to earn more degrees and make more money, work more overtime. I mean, there's something about marriage that matures a man in a way that playing video games in the basement simply never will. And so I think that we need to tell children the truth about the goodness of marriage in terms of their personal lives, their work lives. And then obviously we need to display and talk about how wonderful children are. I mean, one of the reasons why I bring my kids with me when I travel is because they're awesome. And it's great for people to see that. It's great for people to observe that these kids are not draining me, limiting me, shackling me. It's actually the greatest delight of my life. So we need more examples of that. Older couples that are, not older couples, anybody who's married with children, not boasting about their lives, but revealing their life to the next generation who wonders if it's even possible.
That's all for this week. Don't forget to go to the Spectator shop and buy. Also get a subscription to The Spectator. We hope you've enjoyed that omnibus edition. Join us again next week.